right, good evening. Thank you for joining us for this special program. Tonight, we are pleased to welcome Rex Buchanan for a presentation, Water, Energy, and Rural Kansas, How They're Connected, and What the Future May Hold. This program is part of the Crossroads Change in Rural America initiative designed to promote fresh thinking about the history and culture of Kansas and spark new conversations about our state's future. Without further ado, Rex, would you like to tell us a little bit about your background and go ahead and jump right into the presentation?
Okay, thank you. I appreciate the chance to do this. I actually grew up out in central Kansas, not too far west of McPherson. So I'm a native of Kansas. I went to Kansas Wesleyan Salina as an undergraduate, then to Wisconsin to graduate school, and then moved back and went to work at the Geological Survey for the state of Kansas in 1978, and pretty much have been there ever since. The survey is part of the University of Kansas, so in effect, I've been a KU employee and have taught at KU from time to time. The last 5 or 6 years I was at the survey, I was director of the survey. I've done 4 books, basically 3 with the University Press of Kansas, all related to either the geology of Kansas, 1 book on the geology of the Grand Canyon, and then most recent book I did with 2 co-authors is a book on the Petroglyphs, or Native American rock carvings in central Kansas in the Smoky Hills. The 2 co-authors were Burke Griggs, who is a professor of law at Washburn University, and then somebody you might be familiar with is the other co-author is Josh Swati, who is from Ellsworth County and was in the legislature, and actually I think his district extended right up to the edge of Abilene when he was in the legislature. Then he was Secretary of Agriculture for the state for a while, and then went to work for the EPA and then the Land Institute, and now lives in Salina. Anyway, so that's a little bit of my background. And what I want to talk about tonight is, we can go ahead and start with the slide process, is a series of issues that I think a lot of times don't get connected together, but I want to try to bring them together. And really, we're going to talk about 3 things. And one is water-related issues in Kansas. The second is energy. And actually, we'll start with energy. And then rural Kansas demographics. And all of those, I think, are really critical long-term issues. And I think it's important to talk about those things. I think very often we're sort of focused on short-term issues, like what is going to affect the next election cycle. You know, a 2-year outlook seems to be a long time period nowadays. Well, these are issues that are much even beyond that in terms of time frame, and thus I don't think they get the attention that they deserve, and that's what I want to talk about tonight. And then I appreciate you all joining us for this, and I would sure echo the asking for comments or questions when we get through here. So with that, we'll go to the first slide. We're going to talk about energy, and don't freak out about, I come out of the scientific world, and charts and graphs and numbers are kind of who we are and what we do. But I'll try to move through these fairly quickly and just give you really a big picture idea of what's going on. But this is really just to give you some sense of the kind of energy consumption that goes on in Kansas. And what you can see is, for the most part here, much of the energy consumption that goes on in the state still comes from fossil fuels, and particularly natural gas and coal, and much of that is for the generation of electricity. Renewables have played an increasingly important part of that, but you can still see that fossil fuels are a big part of what goes on in the state. Next slide. And this is an energy production estimate, in effect, and this doesn't show renewables on here, but I did want to give you some sense of the kind of energy production that you get from Kansas. Kansas doesn't produce coal anymore, but it does produce a lot of natural gas. It's one of the leading oil-producing states, and I will talk about that more here in just a minute. We'll go on to the next slide. And again, here is to come back to electrical generation, and you can see the role that natural gas plays, but in terms of producing electricity in the state, the coal-fired electricity is second only to renewables. And that coal doesn't come from Kansas, it comes from other sources. And then nuclear brings up, is next with third. So that's basically where the electricity is generated in the state. And that's an important part of the energy production and consumption in Kansas. Next slide. So let's talk about Kansas fairly specifically. And this is a map of oil and gas fields in the state. And you can see that not all counties are created equal when it comes to these resources. And I'm going to spend a little time on oil and gas production here because I want to talk about it in terms of time that it goes across the state. This particular map, hopefully you can see the colors that show up here. To my eye, they're kind of a greenish color. For the most part, those are oil fields. The reds are natural gas fields. And you can see, again, that these are not distributed equally across the state. So let's talk about a little bit of the change of that in time historically. So we'll go to the next slide. And it'll show you how the decade of discovery, and this is oil fields, oil and gas fields by decade of discovery. And like much of Kansas, really the historical change occurs from east to west across the state. So the first oil well discovered in Kansas was found in the 1860s. And you may or may not remember this, but the first oil well in the United States is in Pennsylvania, discovered in 1859. So it's really only a few years after that oil is discovered in Kansas. It's discovered first in Miami County, which is the county that's in just south of Johnson County in kind of northeastern Kansas. It's kind of that reddish blob that is maybe the biggest sort of rectangular reddish blob that's up there close to the Kansas City area. So that was in the 1860s. And then to the south of there, you see another reddish extent down that runs on down into Oklahoma. That was a production that was discovered down in the Neodesha area. Yeah, thank you, Samantha, and dropped down there. That was in the 1890s. And then if you go on to the west there, the biggest county in the state is Butler County, which is one that is, move your cursor 2 counties to the right and to my right and up, and you should the other direction. There, keep going. One more to the right and drop down, and that's Butler County. And Butler County, oil was discovered there in 1915, and that really is what turns Kansas into a major oil and gas producing state. It's really the beginning of turning that part of the world, that sort of south central part of Kansas, into a major oil producer. In fact, you'll hear people talk about the El Dorado field as being what helped win World War I. And to this day, Butler County has produced more oil on a cumulative basis over historical time than any other county in Kansas. Then beginning in the 1920s and 30s, if you go out to sort of north central Kansas, that yellowish greenish area, Russell County, Ellis County, that's the beginning of production out in that part of the world. And today, those are the counties that are really leading oil producing counties. A lot of years, Ellis County, where Hayes is, will be one of the leading oil producing counties. Again, as you see that sort of exploration move to more west central Kansas. The really big green blob that covers southwestern Kansas is the Hugoton natural gas field. That was discovered in 1959, and at the time of its discovery, it was the largest natural gas field in North America. So you can see sort of the progression, but maybe one of the common themes of this is how long ago all of that occurred. So we'll go on to the next slide. None of this is really modern discovery. Yeah, that's great, the little bigger slide there. People, and you may have heard people talk about the phrase peak oil over time. These are 2 graphs, both for the top one for oil, the bottom one for natural gas production, that show 2 things. Each of them shows production on an annual basis, and that's what the green line is on the oil production, and sort of a reddish line on the natural gas production. Those are annual production totals, and then the black line for each of those is cumulative over time. The real thing to pay attention here are those annual totals. And what you can see is for Kansas that oil production really peaks in the 1950s. And very often an awful lot of natural resources, their production and exploitation will follow a classic U-shaped curve. And that's what you see particularly on the oil side of this graph. And this doesn't just apply to oil, it applies to gold and silver and a lot of minerals that very often their discovery and production, you'll see an immediate ramp up, you'll see them peak, and then you'll see them go back down again. You can see that's what oil does, with maybe an exception of a couple of blips off on the right side of that downward slope of the U shape, and that's very often price controlled. In other words, when prices go up, people explore for more oil, they find more oil, and production goes up. But for the most part, it doesn't really arrest that overall U-shaped curve, which is in downward trajectory. Same thing is true for natural gas, which peaks later, peaks in the 70s. But you can see it heads down. Then it makes another pretty good peak, a secondary peak after that. And that is when natural gas prices were deregulated. Prior to that, the federal government regulated natural gas prices. A lot of younger people don't even remember that at one time natural gas prices were controlled by the government. When those were deregulated, natural gas production bumped back up in the state. But then again, you see, in effect, if you smooth that line out, it really is that peak drop. Next slide. This is the same sort of thing here. People have talked about peak oil on a national basis and a worldwide basis in the same way. That is, the idea of peak oil is really, when does your production peak out? Well, you can see that what goes on in terms of Kansas. But when people talk about peak production in the rest of the world, people have been forecasting that we would have peaked out in terms of annual production. They've been forecasting that for years and years and years, beginning as early as the 1950s. And every time we get close to peak oil, that is, thinking that we've produced somewhere in the neighborhood of half and we're on the downward slope, something happens that puts that peak off. Most recently, the thing that happened was the application of some new technologies, and we'll go to the next slide, that allowed us to produce, and this is the same graph for natural gas. Let's go on to the next slide. So some technologies that allowed people to produce particularly natural gas, but also oil in ways that they hadn't been able to produce them before. One is horizontal drilling. And you can see from this slide, a traditional well that's drilled in throughout the world is like that one over there on the left side that just is a straight line down from the surface. That's a traditional vertical well, and that's what people did for the most part up through the 1990s. But beginning about then, and really in the early 2000s, it took off in a big way. People began to do horizontal drilling, and that's what that second oil well does, that goes down to the producing horizon. On this figure, it says gas-rich shale. And then when it hits that rich producing horizon, it goes out horizontally. That allows the wellbore to interact with a lot more of that oil or gas-rich rock that's in the horizon, and thus produce an awful lot more. A lot more. Very often, and there were oil wells that would produce an order of magnitude 10 times more oil than they were producing with a traditional vertical well. So that was one of the big changes. Another change that I'm sure you've all heard of that came along with that was hydraulic fracturing. Hydraulic fracturing or fracking been around for a long time. In fact, really the earliest use of it was in Kansas, out in the Ulysses area in the 1940s. But it was applied in really a big way, and particularly in natural gas in the 2000s. And when that happened, all these rocks that people knew that contained natural gas, but they'd never been able to get the natural gas out of those shales before, suddenly they could produce natural gas. That, again, extended the life of many natural gas fields and again, put off that peak production for both oil and gas off into the future. So really game-changing technologies that came along. Next slide. And those technologies were applied in Kansas, down in south central Kansas in particular. This is a drilling rig. It's a little hard to get the scale, but horizontal drilling rigs are really, really big, a lot bigger than a traditional vertical well. And these were applied down in the Harper, Sumner County areas, right on the Oklahoma border, where people applied that to produce oil, really beginning in the late 2009, 2010. So it really sort of revolutionized the oil business again in Kansas, even at that late date. And Harper County suddenly became one of the leading oil producing counties in the state. Next slide. So here is the oil production by county in Kansas. Don't worry if you can't read every single one of those numbers that's up there. That's not really important. What is important is just seeing where those totals, and these are as of 2019, and you can see some of these numbers. Ellis County that I mentioned as production starting in the 1920s. Ellis and Russell County in particular, Rooks County, Haskell County, another one of those that really came online recently. So you can see that oil production is centered really in just a few counties that are major oil producers today. Next slide. And this is the same thing for natural gas. And probably the big change here are those the numbers that went up in Harper and Barber counties down there on the Oklahoma border, where those kind of dark brown counties are. And again, that was a production function of when that horizontal drilling took place. Still, some of the big production is out in southwestern Kansas in that Hugoton natural gas area. But you've seen from all these other slides that all of that production, both on the oil side and the natural gas side, is on a decline. It gets interrupted from time to time, but there's no question the general trajectory is down. Next slide. I put this in here because coal is an example of that. Kansas was at one time a fairly large coal producing state. Today, there are no operating coal mines in Kansas. This is a big coal shovel down in southeastern Kansas. Kansas has a lot of coal, but it is by and large, the coal seams are too thin. They're high in sulfur. And so for the most part, Kansas really, when it comes to coal, is really not a player anymore. And that's an example of one of those kind of natural resources that played itself out. Next slide. Another coal mine. This one is just north of Pittsburgh, Kansas. But again, those coal mines are gone today. Next slide. And this is one of those natural gas wells that's down there that I talked about before. And it's another example of kind of natural gas production that comes from unexpected places. This is a kind of natural gas production called coal bed methane. If you drill down to the coal beds in the subsurface, you can very often get them to bleed out a certain amount of natural gas. And there was a boom in that in Kansas in the 1990s. But again, that kind of production tends to ramp up in a real hurry, produces an awful lot of natural gas, and then it ramps right back down again in a big hurry. So it tends not to be a long-term source of energy unless prices got really, really high, which they haven't lately. Next slide. And that's some of that coal bed methane production in southeastern Kansas. Let's go on to the next slide then. Here is how that has dropped off. Let's go on to the next slide. I want to make a connection here. And wind power, by the way, is probably the other component of this that's non-fossil fuel related. I know those of you that drive I-70 or almost any part of the state nowadays are familiar with it. Here's a wind farm out in Ellsworth County that's real visible along I-70. Next slide. This is next slide is a map showing of those projects, and there are so many of those projects in Kansas now that this map is already a little bit outdated, and there are more and more that are going in all the time. Kansas, obviously, as you all know, is a windy state, but there are also questions about the impact that has on the landscape, about its impact on wildlife, birds in particular, the impact of transmission lines to move all of that energy out. So again, another source of energy that's become a big deal in Kansas. Next slide. I threw this in there because I want to make the point that there is I'm going to transition now to water, but I want to make the point that it's really not right to consider energy and water as mutually exclusive, because they're interconnected in important ways. And this slide, I think, indicates this. It's a slide showing John Redmond Reservoir, which is a reservoir in Coffee County, Kansas. And you may not be able to see it, but off in the far distance on the horizon is the state's only nuclear generating plant, Wolf Creek Nuclear Power Plant. The cooling water that comes for that power plant, in effect, comes from Coffee County State Lake, but Coffee County State Lake gets the water from John Redmond Reservoir. John Redmond Reservoir, like a lot of big reservoirs in this state, is silting in over time. In fact, an awful lot of the capacity of that reservoir has gone away as a result of natural siltation that's moved into the reservoir. The upshot is the amount of water that was available to cool Wolf Creek is not available the way that it used to be. The option of not cooling that power plant is not an option. You have to be able to cool it. So the state has looked at various ways to try to prevent silt from getting into that reservoir, and then even did a fairly expensive dredging project to remove some of the silt out of that reservoir. So the connection between the energy, and I think you saw in some of the earlier graphs that nuclear power is a big component of Kansas energy production, and the connection between that and water is very strong. There's a nexus between those two that a lot of times people ignore when they think of energy is energy and water is water. Well, there's a strong connection between the two, and this is just an example of that. Next slide. So let's talk about water. I could spend all night on this graph, but I won't, and you can heave a sigh of relief. But just a couple of things I do want to point out. The yellow dotted lines here are lines of average annual precipitation, and you can see they range from actually as little as 15 inches out in western Kansas, average annual precip a year, to as much as 42 to 44 inches down in southeastern Kansas. I said before, I grew up in Rice County, which is right on the line of where that 25-inch line runs, and you all are there in Dickinson County, where it's a little bit wetter than where I grew up. But you have to keep in mind that that number is an average, and one of the things that's clear to me from years and years of both living in Kansas and working at the Geological Survey is that average annual precipitation is just that. When I went back and looked at annual rainfall totals for where I grew up in Rice County, the message I always took away was some years we get an awful lot more, some years we get an awful lot less. And it didn't seem like there were very many years when we got 24, 25 inches, which is the average. And that tends to be true across an awful lot of the state. It's fairly wet right now, but we all probably remember a time about 10 years ago when much of the state was drought stricken. And that story of up and down precip levels is pretty typical. But in general, it's a lot wetter in the east than it is out west. The other part of this map that shows up here is groundwater availability. And that groundwater is the water that's found in pore spaces of rock. The blue on the map is where you can expect to produce on a general basis an awful lot of groundwater. In this case, more than 500 gallons of water per minute, which is a lot of water. And again, you can see there's a lot of groundwater out west. I'll talk about that more in a second. And as you go east across the state, there's less and less, except maybe along the Kansas River. The point of this map, I think that's most important, is that Kansas is really a transitional state when it comes to water. Western Kansas, there's a lot of groundwater, but not much surface water. That is, not much rivers and lakes, because there's not much precipitation. The exact opposite is true in eastern Kansas, where it rains a lot. There are a lot of big rivers, a lot of lakes, but not much groundwater. So Kansas is really like two different states when it comes to water. There's really kind of a tale of a lot of groundwater out west and not much surface water, but a lot of surface water and not much groundwater in eastern Kansas. Next slide. And this is a map that reinforces it. It just basically shows what the water source is for county by county across the state. And the circles that are mostly blue are the ones where people get most of their water from groundwater sources. The red circles are where they get mostly water from surface water. And you can see that pretty much mirrors that earlier map, which is most of the people in eastern Kansas get their water sources from surface water. Out west, it's mostly from groundwater, with an exception or two along the way. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about the groundwater, because that really is going to be that and the impact on rural life is going to be kind of the focus of the rest of what I want to talk about tonight. So this is what people call the High Plains Aquifer. It underlies all of 8 states. You can see it there: Texas, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Kansas, Colorado, an awful lot of Nebraska, and then little chunks of Wyoming and South Dakota. In Kansas, you can see that it covers almost the entire western third of the state, and then much of central Kansas. Doesn't get quite as far east as you all there in Dickinson County, but it didn't get too far away. Next slide. And again, the water is found in an aquifer is just an underground rock formation that you can produce water out of. Groundwater doesn't come out of underground lakes or streams. You couldn't drill a hole in the ground and send a scuba diver down into an aquifer and let them paddle around. It's found more like in a sponge type situation, where there are, in effect, pore space in rock and sand and gravel to fill up with water that infiltrates down from the surface. Next slide. So in Kansas, that High Plains Aquifer that I was talking about really is made up of 3 components: mixed, The first one is the Ogallala Formation, and I'm sure you've all heard of the Ogallala. It's really about the third of the High Plains Aquifer in the western part of the state. Next. The next is the Great Bend Prairie Aquifer that's somewhat shallower, nearer to the surface aquifer in central Kansas. And then finally, the next one is the Equus Beds Aquifer in the McPherson County, Sedgwick County, Harvey County area. So those three make up the High Plains Aquifer. Well, I'm really going to talk about the Ogallala because that's really kind of the name of the game when we talk about resource depletion in western Kansas now. Next slide. So the Ogallala is really the source of much of what goes on in that part of the world in terms of irrigation. Now, beginning in, say, the 20s and 30s, people began to pump water out of the Ogallala and put it onto fields to grow crops. But the problem was if the fields weren't level, the water wouldn't spread out the best way. And so beginning really in the 50s, people began to use this form of irrigation, center pivot systems. And you see those all over the state, but they really pretty much replaced that old-fashioned flood irrigation. They're far more efficient. They can grow across a hilly landscape, and they really revolutionize agriculture out in western Kansas because you saw before that precipitation map basically showed you how dry it is out there, but with the use of water that you can now apply widely out of the Ogallala through an awful lot of areas with center pivot irrigation, you can now begin to grow crops, and in particular corn, that you couldn't ordinarily grow out there. So center pivot irrigation changes the landscape completely. Next slide. This is what one of those looks like from the air. I always tell people I like flying over western Kansas in airplanes, particularly commercial flights, because I'm always impressed at what people think these circles are. And I'm always amazed at what kind of stories they'll believe when you tell them that these were actually created by UFOs, which of course they weren't, but people sometimes from New York might believe that story. Anyway, this is what one looks like from the air. Next slide. So with the production of corn, people were able to do things in that part of the world they couldn't previously do. And one was to bring in big feedlots and produce cattle, because now suddenly you have a lot of kinds of grains available you didn't have before. With those big feedlots come the advent of big packing plants. And this is what used to be the IBP plant out by west of Garden City in Finney County. It's near the little town of Holcomb. Today it's a Tyson plant. And at the time it was constructed, it was one of the largest packing plants in the world. It could slaughter 5,500 head of cattle today. With those big packing plants, and there were 5 of them in western Kansas, in Liberal and Dodge and Garden City, people came into the state to work in those packing plants. So you get immigration into particularly the Garden City area, where something like 26 different languages are spoken in the school system as people move in from other countries, particularly say Vietnam or other places, to work in those packing plants. So you have a change in the culture that's a result of the change in the agriculture, which all comes back to water. In effect, without water, you can't grow corn. Without corn, you don't have those big feedlots. Without the feedlots, you don't have the packing plants. And without the packing plants, you don't get the change in the landscape that takes place as a result of what's going on out in western Kansas. Next slide. So let's talk about what's going on with the water table. Now, this map doesn't show the entire state. It only shows about the western half of the state. So Dickinson County isn't in here, but you can see Cheyenne County in far southwestern Kansas, northwestern Kansas, that is. Morton County in southwestern Kansas. It goes as far as Sumner County down there in southeast. And what this shows is the amount of aquifer that is saturated with water before you begin pumping up water for irrigation, really beginning in the 20s and 30s. And the darker it is means the more water that is down there. The big takeaway from this is in the Ogallala and throughout the High Plains Aquifer, it's not one big continuous underground bathtub of water. Don't think of it that way. Think of it more like an egg crate with pockets of water in certain places. And the big takeaway from this particular map is one of those big pockets is under southwestern Kansas, lesser extent in northwestern Kansas and west central Kansas, and in parts of western Kansas, basically virtually no groundwater whatsoever. So it's a highly heterogeneous area. That is very different from place to place to place out there. Next slide. We go out there and measure water levels to get a handle on how much they've dropped as a result of pumping out of the aquifer. The map that you can see here with all those little dots on it is 12 to 1,400 wells that we go out, mostly irrigation wells, and every January we go out and measure water levels in there to get some sense of how much they've changed. We don't measure them in every well. There are a ton more wells than that are out there, but we do measure enough to give us some sense of what's going on. Next slide. I think this is a picture of me. I put this in because I still go out there and help measure those wells. There are a bunch of us that go out every January. We measure them in January because the wells aren't pumping and you can't measure those wells when they are pumping. Some years it's nice, like the weather was on this particular day in January down outside of Elkhart. A lot of years it's not so nice, but it's a fun job, and I enjoy going out there. And basically, you put a steel tape down the well, you crank it back up, it washes some chalk off the tape, and you can do some math and see how deep the water level is. Next slide. And this shows how much those water levels have changed in an absolute basis. And by that, I just mean here's how many feet the water level has declined. And so where you see those brown colors in southwestern Kansas, that's really a function of water levels have declined more than 150 feet since people began to put in really large-scale irrigation development. Less declines in other places. So those are absolute, the total decline in terms of feet. Next slide. Another way to look at this is on a percentage basis, because remember when I showed you the slide just a couple of slides ago that showed how much more water there was in southwestern Kansas than there was in the rest of the state. Well, let's say you have 300 feet of saturated thickness, 300 feet of water, and you take out 150 feet. Well, you've still got 150 feet left, so that's quite a bit. But in west central Kansas, where you see the darker colors here, if you only start off with say 175 feet and you take out 150, well, then you've really depleted the aquifer. So this map shows those depletions not by feet, but by the percentage. And the darker they are, the bigger percent of the aquifer that's been depleted. And there you can see there's less depletion maybe in southwestern Kansas, but more in west central Kansas. So that's really probably a little more accurate way of looking at this particular issue. And you can see again how much the aquifer has dropped across the western part of the state. Next slide. This is kind of the $64 question slide. This one is a rough approximation of how long the aquifer may last if conditions stay the way they are now. That is, based on how much people have withdrawn water over the past 10 years, if you project that off into the future, how long can you expect it to last? These are rough approximations. We don't really know how much it's going to rain, what corn prices are going to do, what energy prices are going to do. And again, remember that connection between water and energy. When energy prices go up, people don't pump as much because energy is expensive. We don't know how that's going to shake out. So all we can do is project into the future based on what people have done in the past. But again, what you see are the darker browns are in effect in areas where, in effect, a lot of that pumping is already, that large scale pumping is already not feasible. The red areas are where the forecasted life of the aquifer may be 25 years. And again, one of the big take-home lessons is not all areas are created equally. You can see west central Kansas is it's much tougher shape when it comes to estimated life of the aquifer, say, than southwestern Kansas, which has already seen some big declines, but had a lot more water to begin with. Next slide. This is, I want to shift gears now. So we've talked about, in effect, kind of declining oil and gas production across the state, particularly across, say, the western half of the state. We've talked about water depletion, particularly declining production across much of the western third of the state. Now I want to talk a little bit about demographics and tie those things together, and then we'll finish up. So this is just basically a graph showing urban and rural population in Kansas over time. And the blue is rural population. The greenish is the percentage that is urban. And you can see that change over time. And I put this in there because I think, I grew up on a farm out in the middle of Kansas. And many of you there in Dickinson County, or maybe Abilene's not a huge town. It's a relatively small town. And I think most of us that grew up in that kind of setting tend to think of Kansas as a rural state. That's kind of the image we have of ourselves. In a lot of respects, that's not really true. And here are some examples of that. About half of the population of Kansas lives in 5 out of 105 counties. Half of the population of the state lives in Johnson, Wyandotte, Shawnee, Douglas, all of which are in northeastern Kansas, and then Sedgwick down in the Wichita area. So half of the population in just 5 out of 105 counties. Almost a quarter of the population, about 20%, and going up all the time, lives in Johnson County, just one county. Here's another way I like to talk about this, because I think this really helps illustrate this issue better. There is a mall in Overland Park. I can't remember exactly what street it's on. It's either 95th Street or 75th Street. Doesn't really matter. It's called Oak Park Mall, great big giant mall. And this number isn't particularly recent, because the people don't go to malls quite the way they used to. But at one point in about 2010, Oak Park Mall, one single mall in Overland Park in Johnson County, produced more sales tax revenue than 59 of the Kansas counties combined. Okay? So one mall in one county, in one corner of the state, generated more sales tax than 59 Kansas counties rolled up together. So that'll give you a sense of the disproportionate impact of the economics of the state, rural versus urban. Next slide. So let's look at that a little bit. This is a map that shows what year, county by county, the particular counties max out in terms of their population. I'm going to put my glasses on here real quickly just so I can look at some of these in particular. If you can't see those, don't worry too much about it. But I see that for Dickinson, it's 1930. And that's not too unusual. There are a fair number of Kansas counties as you look off to the west in which peak population is really like 1910 or much even earlier. For some of them, it's in the 1900, or it might even be a county or two, which it's 1890. Yeah, it is for Washington County, for example. So there are an awful lot of counties that really peak out in terms of their population more than 100 years ago. There are some that are still hitting peaks, as you can see here. Many of them are those 5 counties that I talked about, where half the population lives. Some of them are those counties out in southwestern Kansas where those packing plants are, Ford and Finney and Seward, which peak. This doesn't have the 2020 census in it, but they would continue to grow. Next slide. So that's the maximum population in a given year. This is the percent population change from 2010 to 2010. And you see again where there are reductions, it shows in red, and where there are increases, shown in blue. Again, these don't have the 2020 census numbers, which just came out, but they're just basically, for the most part, a continuation. And what you see are very many of those rural counties, a lot of them western Kansas, but not all of them. I mean, some of them there in south central Kansas as well, where you see those declines in population. Now, you may look at this and say, well, maybe it's not that big a deal, but you've got to keep in mind that some of these counties, like Wallace County, out there on the Colorado border, where it's a percent decline of 15%, these are counties that have a very low population level to begin with. So if you take 15% away from a relatively low population basis, you're really talking about very, very low levels of population across much of western Kansas, north central Kansas, and parts of south central Kansas. You in Dickinson County may be a little bit immune to that, but certainly counties not very far away from you deal with it, whereas the rich are getting richer in terms of population as you look again at Douglas and Johnson and Miami County and Sedgwick County, where population increases go up. Next slide. And then this finally is projection off into the future, and basically what you see here is by and large a continuation of more of the same. Now, the point I really want to make here is that very many of these same counties that you see in the red, and again, this is projecting change from 2014 to 2044. If trends continue the way they have in the past, here again are what these counties can expect to do in terms of population. And there's Wallace County, again, they're out there on the far border of western Kansas that doesn't have much population to begin with, that in effect is losing almost half of its population in that process. And you can see that occurs in many of the same areas where we saw those declines, both in terms of water and in oil and natural gas production. So the same counties that are already struggling with depopulation, that when you throw in the issues related to natural gas and natural resources, oil, water, natural gas, you can see in some respects it compounds that. And even more noticeable is in some of the counties, like in Johnson County, where I talked about how much population there was already in Johnson County and the economic activity that's there. You look at Johnson County in that projection, and you see a projected increase of greater than 50%. One of the problems that Johnson County does not have is water. It has plenty of water, much of it coming up through down the Missouri River, so that water doesn't pose a problem. So in some respects, the same issues, natural resource issues that have contributed a little bit to how we got into this situation in the first place in terms of demographics, help contribute to the continuation of that. Next slide. Now, those demographic changes are complex, and there's an awful lot that's going on. We'll go to the next slide after this one. Because the state has been looking at issues related to rural depopulation for a long time. The Governor Kelly's office created an Office of Rural Prosperity that went out and looked at those issues and identified some areas that I'm sure you all are familiar with there in Abilene in terms of dealing with keeping people in your towns. One of them is housing, which is critical for a lot of people. Child care is particularly an issue for keeping younger people in towns. Rural health care is important for the aging populations, and some of those counties out in north central Kansas have some of the most aged populations of any counties out on the Great Plains, so access to health care is really important to them. Infrastructure is important, and infrastructure defined broadly, not just as roads or highways or airports, but also for broadband access. And then finally, workforce education and retention. You notice in establishing those priorities, natural resources really don't figure into that conversation. And one of the points I want to make tonight with this conversation is they really should. That in addition to all of these issues that we face as in terms of how we deal with the rural population and rural issues in Kansas, on top of all of those, we're dealing with water and energy issues that compound that. So I think, next slide, I think that sort of brings us to the end. I appreciate your attention and you tuning in tonight, and any questions or thoughts you might have. I'd particularly be interested in your perspective in terms of any thoughts you have in terms of the rural depopulation issues there in Dickinson County, and thoughts you might have in terms of dealing with that. And I think with that, Samantha, we're ready to open it up or go to questions and comments or conversation. So thank you again, and I will turn it back over to you guys.
So thank you. If you have any questions, you can either type them in the chat or you can unmute yourself. We don't have anyone on the phone, so if you are if you are online with us, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Well, we sort of wait for that. One last thing I might toss in, because it's a fairly recent development, but there is the state recently funded a study that was done by both the state and the Kansas Sampler Foundation down in Inman. It's an outfit run by Marcy Penner and folks there, and they did interviews with folks who live in rural areas and talked to sort of identify what keeps them there, what kinds of issues they face. And very many of the same things that I touched on are issues that face, but they also, on top of that, are dealing. One of the issues that they raised was an issue of diversity. And in the interviews that that Marcy and those folks did with 400 or 500 of those younger folks out in those towns. One of the lessons that I took, or one of the messages I took away from those interviews, was the value that people in those small towns place on diversity. So it's in addition to health care and child care and housing, they also valued diversity in all of its forms, and that's important to them as well.
All right, we do have a question in the chat, and it says, what's happening in, let me preface this by saying I may mispronounce these counties because I'm new here. So I don't know how things are pronounced a little differently here. So what's happening in Kiowa County?
Hey, you did just fine. Good.
Hey,
there you go.
population projected to drop where they are fossil fuels area.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I would say Kiowa County certainly is one of those where they did see something of a boom with oil production and with that horizontal drilling that I was talking about before. But that has dropped off pretty dramatically. And they now face, I think, depopulation to a certain extent related to that. Another county I didn't point out as we went through there that I think that I have heard folks say exactly that about is Stanton County, which is the very southwesternmost county, or not quite the most southwesternmost county. It's one north of Morton County. But Stanton County is another one that has undergone some depopulation, again, because oil and gas production has gone down. So yeah, I think that's what's going on in that part of the state. And unless you've got something new that comes in to replace that natural resource depletion, then you see that those population declines take place.
All right, we have a question that says, how do aquifers get new water?
Yeah, before I answer that, Joy, I want to say that the word to watch out for, if anybody ever asked you to pronounce the name of a city, it's spelled O-L-A-T-H-E. It's pronounced Olathe. I once heard Garrison Keeler, who used to do Prairie Home Companion, came and did a show in Kansas City, and he pronounced it Olathe. And I thought he was going to get run out of town. So there's one to watch out for. And by the way, it's also, I want you to know, it's the Arkansas River. It's not the Arkansas River. Please don't ever call it the Arkansas River, at least not around me. Okay, how do aquifers get there? Aquifers are recharged through surface infiltration, kind of the way you would naturally think they would be. And when it rains, the water goes into the subsurface and eventually gets into the underground. For the most part, that and we call that, in my world, we refer to that as recharge. Okay, the problem is when you get out in western Kansas, it doesn't rain very much. A lot of the rainfall occurs in the summertime and it evaporates. So about the only time you get much recharge is in the winter if you get a lot of snow. The recharge rate we estimate in parts of western Kansas is roughly a half an inch to an inch or two per year. It's variable, but let's call it an inch a year. Those maps that I showed you in parts of southwestern Kansas, the aquifer is declining at the rate of 4 feet per year on average. Over the long term, maybe not quite that much, but let's say in a given year, 3 feet, okay? So if the decline is, if you're taking out, in effect, 36 inches in a year, and the natural recharge is only an inch, in effect, it's not really a renewable resource. We think of water as a renewable resource because it rains. But if you're taking it out at 36 times the rate that it's going back into the aquifer, it's not a renewable resource. So in effect, recharge really isn't much of an issue out in western Kansas. You get into your part of the world where it rains more, soils are more sandy, the aquifers are closer to the surface, then you get much higher recharge rates. And so you might get 6 or 8 inches of recharge rate in central Kansas, or even in that area around where you are in Dickinson County. That way you can sustain irrigation much more successfully than you could, say, out west where recharge is at a much lower rate.
Okay. Don't see a new question. While we're waiting, oh, there's one. Are they planning to remove silt from the Wolf Creek power plant cooling reservoir? And is it a serious problem now? Or when? Will wind energy production grow in Kansas? Okay,
yeah, those are kind of two-part questions. The first on Wolf Creek, the state a few years ago did a dredging and John Redmond is a big reservoir. I didn't have a picture of it in the slides that I just showed, but it's a big, relatively flat reservoir, and it is silted into the point that I think the average depth of the thing now is like 6 to 8 feet. You could almost walk across it if you were tall enough, except you would sink into the silt. But because the state knows it can't go away, it has to be there to supply cooling water for Wolf Creek. The state a few years ago did a dredging project there and spent about $25 million to remove some of that silt. The problem with that is, obviously, it's a lot of money, and it's a short-term solution because the first time you get really big rainfall, it'll flood a bunch of that silt back in, and so you're right back where you started. That kind of siltation has taken place in a lot of the reservoirs in the state, probably the closest ones to you all out there where you are. Milford, to some extent, Canopolis Reservoir out to the further west of you. All of those are silting in more and less, and we have become extremely reliant on those reservoirs for water supply, so they can't just go away. People are looking at other ways to try to get that silt out of there, flushing it through a variety of, trying to keep it from going in the first place. But it is an expensive process, and it's one that you have to deal with. Right now, there isn't any long-term projection to take Wolf Creek down, so one way or another, the state has got to figure out a way to deal with that siltation, particularly for John Redmond. And I forgot the second half of the question. I knew that was going to happen.
So the second question is actually kind of goes along with the question I had, which his question is, will wind energy production grow in Kansas? My question goes a little bit further than that, and it is, will wind energy eventually surpass oil and natural gas, or at least be on par with?
Yeah, that is so. Wind energy production is increasing over time. There are more and more wind farms coming on year by year, and really none of them are going down, and they're becoming more efficient. A lot of them are becoming bigger, so that is getting bigger all the time. There's no question that if you put oil, natural gas, and coal-fired power plants together, that we are still extremely reliant on fossil fuels. When those lines are going to cross, Joe, I don't know right off the top of my head. That day is still a ways off, but it may not be as far away as you might think it is, or that some people might think it is. Particularly, I think, and one things that I didn't touch on tonight that will play a role in this undoubtedly then will be the advent of large-scale solar as well. And I didn't talk about that tonight. We haven't seen quite the advent of that in the state, but I don't think there's any question we're going to, because the economics of that are getting better all the time. And as they do, I think you'll see more and more of that kind of production. Basically, solar facilities come into the state probably on down the road over the next few decades as well. So, nobody has a real crystal ball here, but if somebody said that those lines were going to cross over the next 10 or 20 years, I certainly wouldn't argue with that. And it may very well, things may happen a lot sooner than you think. And particularly oil prices have gone back up lately. So as energy gets more expensive, people will begin to look at other renewables in ways that they haven't in the past. One thing I didn't toss in there is biofuels, which people talk about also then, like ethanol. And if you toss that in there, again, that increases that renewables part of the equation as well. And Kansas is a big deal in terms of the amount of wind energy that's going on, but it also poses questions of transmission in terms of how you get that energy to the places where people really need it. So that's part of it as well.
All right. We have a comment that ethanol is a water problem too.
In terms of ethanol, it takes a lot of water to produce the grains that go into making ethanol. So corn, in particular, to a lesser extent, milo doesn't take quite as much water. But that's a good point, and it's also a great point in terms of that energy-water nexus that I was talking about before. That you can't just look at biofuels as somehow water independent, because it takes a lot of water to grow them. It takes some water to also manufacture them, but really the big water usage is to grow the corn in the first place. And so that has an impact as well. So yeah, there are water issues probably far more related to biofuels than there would be with, certainly with wind energy, where there really aren't any. So there is a connection there.
All right. We have another question says, I was not aware of the nuclear power plant in Kansas. How reliant are we on that for energy production? Do we see that, sorry, do we see that reliance growing or declining in the future?
I think that is the Wolf Creek produces about 20%, maybe slightly less, but in that ballpark of the state's electrical usage. So how reliant you are on that electricity depends on where you live. If you live more in kind of east central part of the state, you're probably far more likely to be reliant on than if you were way out in western Kansas. But 20% is not an inconsequential amount of electricity. And the nice thing about, and I know there are all sorts of arguments about nuclear power, particularly related to disposal of the radioactive waste, but the nice thing about it is that it's reliable in the sense of it's always there. You know, it's not like wind and solar that come and go depending on the wind blowing or night and day or the weather. So nuclear is really one of those that's a very stable energy source. That power plant was built in the late 70s and the early 80s, went online. And I can't remember what the projected lifespan of that was, but I think we're past what the initial lifespan was projected to be, but it's been extended because the power, for the most part, that technology has been pretty successful. It's also expensive, and nobody talks about building new nuke plants in the state. But but nobody talks about decommissioning that plant because 20% is a lot of electricity for the state.
All right. Now, this question you may have answered, and I missed it. Sometimes I get a little busy, but you were talking about how 50% of the population in Kansas is concentrated in 5 counties. Historically, populations settle really by water, by natural resources that they can use. Is that what happened in Kansas? That, you know, this is where the natural resources were concentrated, so that's where the population was, you know, built up?
Yeah, that is a good point. And I like to talk about that. I give a talk about the history of water in the state. And there's no question that a lot of the state's biggest cities like Wichita and Kansas City, and to a certain extent Manhattan and Lawrence and Topeka, Salina, they are along rivers. So there isn't any question that there is a connection between that natural resource and where a lot of the big cities get built. And you can even see that even on further west, like with Garden City. But an awful lot of those counties where I talked about population peaking out in the 1890s, the other thing that really was a driving force was just simply a belief in agriculture in that part of the world, and basically the big plow up that people refer to, going out there and tearing up the ground and planting wheat, and a belief that that ground, and many of those counties were settled during a relatively wet time, and so there was a belief that they were always going to get that amount of rain. Then when they didn't, people had to move out, and a lot of those counties never really recovered those initial populations. And one important point that I think, way to think about that, a lot of times people look at those maps and they say, man, population empties out in the 1890s and it continues to empty out, and isn't that a shame? And you know, I grew up out in rural Kansas, and it is a shame, but it also may be that really those counties were never meant to support really big populations like they did in the 1890s during times of high precipitation. And maybe in some respects what they are is trying to figure out a way to live within their means when it comes to precipitation and rainfall. So so water was a big driver, but those other factors, like to a certain extent oil and gas exploration, but also ag is really one of the big ones as well.
Okay, we're almost out of time, but I have one more question or maybe comment related to something you asked, and then one more question from the chat. But you were asking about the depopulation and of some of the areas, and as a new transplant, I found one of the things that I found interesting here is that I moved here with no kids and unmarried, and I'm in Geary County. one of the hardest things for me was to find housing. And it was interesting because honestly, the cost of living here is pretty low. And I thought, oh, it'd be easy for me to find housing. I came here, I visited it, I didn't find anything. And then I looked up on this house. But one of my first thoughts here was that if I was a family moving here, this would be difficult. Because there's a big gap too in, what a 1-bedroom might cost as opposed to a 3-bedroom. I mean, it's a pretty large gap. And then adding in childcare and things like that. So that's the comment part. The question part of that is, I'm only 20 minutes from Manhattan. How are we going about trying to attract people, and curb the depopulation of these areas? And you and I were talking at the beginning, before the program started. I'm from rural North Florida, where they somewhat have some of the same problems. People are depopulating, they're leaving because there are no jobs for them. There isn't any housing for them unless you live on family land, So what are the efforts that are being made, or are the efforts that have been made, are they starting to see some successful results from that?
Yeah, to go back to your first point about the housing, I just read a long article in the Salina Journal last week about a housing study in Salina that really points out exactly what you were just talking about. And there were people who own companies in Salina that have hired people, made successful hires, but then people can't find housing when they come into Salina. And Salina probably doesn't have the problem to quite the extent that, say, even a smaller town has, where, and I grew up in the kind of a town where, somebody might want to come in and build a new house, but if they do, nobody's ever going to buy that house for the amount of money that costs to build it. So nobody builds a house for anybody to come in and rent because it just doesn't make any economic sense. So that housing stock issue is one that's been out there for a while and has not gotten, from what I can tell, much closer to resolution. But there's no question that people identify it as one of the big issues that folks are facing. In terms of efforts that people have made in the past, I think some of them have been those kind of housing attractions. A little town of Marquette, which is just south of Salina, that I'm familiar with, like a lot of little towns out there, basically offered free land to people that wanted to move in and build a house. And sometimes that will work, but very often it works only in places that are close enough to big population centers. Like you live in Junction City, which has Fort Riley close to it, which is a big, stable workforce. Geary County and Riley County and Pottawatomie County, I think, was the largest population increase of any county in the state in the 2020 census. And very much of that is kind of the boom that's going on associated with hiring, associated with K-State, and to a lesser extent in Junction City. But very often, so in those cases, it's almost a case, again, of the rich getting richer, in the sense of those populations where people are clumped up, it becomes sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's partly why I think that rural prosperity report that I referenced in the talk, and then the Sampler Foundation report, I think those issues they identify are so important, because the big sales pitch I think everybody can make in those little towns is quality of life. I mean, they've got good school systems, and they have the quality of life in a lot of respects there. I mean, you don't have to worry about your commute, maybe, walking 2 blocks to someplace. I mean, the quality of life is great. I know what that's about from growing up out there. But you've got to have the jobs, you've got to have the housing, you've got to have childcare accessible so that you don't have to drive 45 minutes each way to get childcare. That emphasis on diversity is part of it as well. People want welcoming communities, and without that, you are not going to have people who hang around. And right now, we seem to train an awful lot of kids that the first thing they want to do is move away. And I think we all know examples of that. And if we don't figure out a way to deal with all of those issues, the 2030 census is going to look just like everything we just looked at in the 2010 and 2020 census. So it looks like we're past time here. Did you have another question, or what do you want to do?
I was going to ask this last question in the chat, and then I'll wrap it up. So the question is about solar production. Of course, we're kind of seeing an increase in solar production or solar energy, but also we hear these cries for saving or reviving fossil fuels, in particular coal. So do you project or do you see an effort to revive coal?
It is really hard for me to see the future for coal just in terms of economics. It just tends not to work. And you can argue climate change all you want to. I don't think there's much of an argument there. The only way coal is going to work is if you can take the carbon dioxide out of the waste stream, sequester the carbon dioxide. That gets really, really expensive. And it's hard for me to see the long term that that's going to work. By the same token, people said kind of the same thing about natural gas. And then when fracking came along and horizontal wells came along, suddenly you could produce all this natural gas you didn't used to be able to produce. Far be it for me to predict the end of fossil fuels, because lots of people have done that and lots of people have been wrong. But it does appear that the economics of renewables have hit a point where that they are on the horizon, such that that day it may not be immediate, but the direction it seems to me like is fairly clear. And again, if you factor climate change into that, and again, I know some people may disagree about the specter of climate change, but the world I live in, people really don't. The importance of those renewables, I think, is even greater than it ever has been. And that's a whole nother talk and a whole nother topic, but one that I think is really important as well.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I don't think there are any other questions, and we are a little over time. So if you give me just a few minutes to make a few closing announcements, we will close out the program. So tonight's program is sponsored by the Eisenhower Foundation with generous support from the Jeff Coat Foundation. Our program is also brought to us by Humanities Kansas, an independent nonprofit spearheading a movement of ideas to empower the people of Kansas to strengthen their communities and our democracy. We have some upcoming programs. Thursday, October 28th at noon Central, we are pleased to welcome the International Atomic Energy Agency. The IAEA's genesis was President Eisenhower's 1953 Atoms for Peace speech addressed to the General Assembly of the United Nations. This talk will give an overview of the IAEA's history, highlight connections with Eisenhower, and showcase treasures from the IAEA's archives. We will learn more about the history of this organization. Then we will have our next book club chat on Tuesday, November 9th at 7 p.m. Central. Our next book selection is The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. We are pleased to welcome Dr. Jean Chavez as our facilitator. Please join us on November 16th at noon for a special presentation from NASA on Eisenhower and the founding of NASA. Thank you for joining us tonight. Have a great evening, and we will see you at our next program.